So I'd like to welcome everybody to the April Policy Committee meeting. Let me get in here, the meeting. I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I will ask Ashley Kitten if she has any announcements. I do not. Okay. We will move on to the minutes. Has the committee had a chance to look at the minutes? And you okay sending them to legislative? Yes, yes. Yeah. I see lots of nods. Okay. So we will move that forward, and we are at old business second readings.
Okay, and our practice that we have been moving forward is second readings. To just go back, was there anything that we needed to go through in anything from 002, 003, the 137 series to 907.1. We discussed, we added corrections from the last discussion points that we had. Anything that we feel like we need to go over from.
Okay, so first I'm going to ask the committee. No. Okay. Oh, yes. All right, Mark, go ahead since you're ready before us.
Well, you are on the committee and I am not, but 002 and 003 have similar but slightly different language, and I just wanted to make sure I understood what they say. In 002, it says in 2.2, it says a 2/3 vote of the full board, which I think means at least 6, no matter how many are at the meeting. It does beg the question, although I don't think this is a question we need to answer in policy, what happens if there are empty board seats for that language, but I don't think we need to necessarily clarify that in language. That's more of a legal question. 003 in 121 says, only by the affirmative vote of a majority of the board. I'm not clear whether that a majority of the board means the full board or the members present that form the quorum. And both of these, there is language around both of these concepts in school code, which I did not have a chance to look up, but I think whatever that language is, we should mirror.
Yep, and I believe that's why this language is in green, Mr. Diazio put in, because it was the language mirrored from school code.
I hate it when school code is more confusing than
in each of the respective
yes.
policies. Yeah.
I noticed the same thing, Mark, and I think the reason for it, is 002 is talking about changing quote unquote local board procedures, whereas 003 is talking about making exceptions to board policies, which is broader than just the local board procedures. I think that's the difference. I picked up on that difference in wording, and I do think it's a higher standard to change your own board operating procedures as opposed to your policy about, you know, what schools students can be assigned to or whatever. I think that's the reason.
So you think 003 does mean a majority of the full board, meaning 5, no matter how many are present at the meeting? If that's the language in school code, I think we got to stick with it and let, case law, et cetera, be the interpreter. But if it's not the language in school code, I think adding the word full there would be my preference. I have one more in 216, but I don't know if anyone has anything else. In 318, it specifically mentions district policy, but it needs a reference.
Okay, so we can add a reference in 3.1.8 and not sure on your first point.
I think it's a delegation of responsibility unless it's in something else that I don't remember. in which case I'd prefer to see it there and be explicitly written in that typical language.
Delegate as a
Yeah.
delegation.
Because I don't think it's something that the board is trying to, so, the difference typically is that in policy, what is the board stipulating, and then delegation responsibility is what do we want the AR to clarify? What do we want the superintendent to clarify in an AR? And I don't think I think that's what we're trying to accomplish here, but because I'm not certain that's what we're trying to accomplish, I want to be sure I'm getting it right.
I thought it referenced what our AR should have in it. And so maybe if that's what it is, maybe it should say the district's administrative regulation for compilation retention, because it's kind of saying the things that we need to make sure our procedures or our admin regs provide for, that we inform parents, we establish guidelines for disclosure, we ensure our records are destruction of records. So I read it to be that it's our admin reg has to make sure that it meets all these requirements.
Yeah, in which case, that's right, so that's what I read as well. So then I think this belongs in delegation of responsibility.
3.1,
All
all the way down to
3.1.
3.1.
That's how I would do it.
My reading of this, and I guess this gets to a philosophical question of what's delegation of responsibility or guidelines, is I think Dr. Smith's reading that the guidelines, I think, are really meant to specify that when an AR is generated, it meets those criteria.
Jenna?
So there is language in the delegation of responsibility that says that the superintendent or designee, shall develop an AR. So yeah, I read it the same way, that we're saying, hey, you have to develop an AR, but here's what, just in terms of broad categories, we want to be in the AR, and those are our guidelines. So I'm okay with it being in guidelines. I'm not going to die on the hill about it, but I think it's more than just a standard delegation of, typically when we see the delegation of responsibility, it's saying basically what this says, hey, administration, please, elaborate on this in an AR. Here, we're giving a lot more specificity about what topics need to be covered. So that was in my mind why it was in guidelines anyway, so.
Yeah, I'm not going to die on the hill over it either. It just doesn't read like our other policies do.
So no one's dying on that hill, so we can just leave it the way it is? No casualties with this policy? Okay. I
Now, if
think
there's an Oxford comma missing, that's a whole other topic.
I will die on that hill. Okay. I care about my Oxford commas. Okay, so I do have, does anyone else have any, I have some, okay, go ahead, Jenna.
Well, while we're talking about Oxford commas, and let's just stick on 216 for a second. One of my comments, it's minor, but when we're in those guidelines and it says, it shall provide the following, I would separate those by, semicolons. And that means 3.1.7 should have a semicolon with an and, yeah. Commas are fine too, but yeah, I would just, it's a list. So lists you would typically separate with some kind of comma. The only other thing I had on that one, and I have some comments on the prior ones, but since we're on 216, in 1.3, it says that, parents and guardians and students will be notified annually. How do we do that? Do we really have a process for notifying annually? Anytime I see this where it has some affirmative duty for us to notify, I just always have that question about how are we doing that? Because it makes it sound like it's more than just having it in this policy.
So I can't speak specifically to Upper Dublin, so I can check on how Upper Dublin does it. In my past experiences, it's usually part of two places. When you have your back to school information that goes out, whether that's a digital communication or where parents are verifying their address, and that is usually included in there. It's also usually included in in a handbook or references policy in the handbook. I have started to make a list of, with the PNN's help, of all those annual notices that are required, so that we make sure next year when we start out the year, I want to put behind it, where is that notice and what time of year is that going out? So I can look into if Upper Dublin does it that way, or maybe somebody else around the table knows that, but that's been the practice that I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I have no objection to providing it annually, and you'll see, you know, as we continue to look at these, there are references like this in lots of different policies that will, you know, provide notice. And my concern is just always making sure we're tracking that and what's the forum and that it's actually happening and we do what we say.
That's a good AR topic. I mean, the AR for this can say that's where it will happen.
That was all I had on 216 anyway. I don't know if you want to stick with that one for now and then go back to the other ones. How do you want to proceed?
I'm going to say my issue and then we'll go back, then we can go back in order. So this is not substantive, but policies 137, 137.1, 137.2, 216, and 907.1. They don't follow exactly, you know, we've been slowly changing the format that we use where we get rid of purpose. And we go, I wrote it down. It usually goes definitions, then delegation of responsibility, then guidelines. That's. So I don't always see it, like when I was looking through, what's the difference between authority and delegation of responsibility? Okay, Mark, go ahead. I know. But I don't always see authority. It's not in all the policies.
In policymaking in general, not if you ask the PSBA, but in policymaking in general, authority is supposed to say, where do we, the school board who's establishing this policy, derive the authority to establish this policy? Usually it's a citation to school code. It might be we are just asserting the authority in certain cases, but it's where do we derive the authority to make this statement? PSBA, and I ask this explicitly because so many of their policies put policy language in the authority section. I said, why do you do that? What does authority really mean? And they gave sort of a wishy-washy answer that to them authority is where you're making statements that you are authoritatively making, which is the whole policy to me.
Right. That's why, it's policy.
It's very hard for me to defend or even portray the PSBA's position because I just so don't understand it. But that's what authority is supposed to be, and that's what none of our policies use it for.
Right, so we're in agreement, purpose shouldn't be there. So if purpose is in any of these.
Purpose in policymaking in general is generally sort of a plain language
We've gotten rid
description.
of it.
Yeah. Which is not meant to be real policy language, just sort of
Right.
a description, and then you get into the legalese later.
Right. Okay. And then, so definitions, delegation, guidelines. But did we get rid, where are we with authority? Because I don't always see it.
I've been trying to die on this hill
As
for
a
a long
society,
time.
it's only to cite the school code, where it comes from. It tells everyone, this is where.
This is why
policy.
we can make, why we're allowed to make this rule.
Okay.
But none of our policies use it that way. And I've been trying for a long time and never seem to be able to get traction with it. So I've kind of surrendered on this point, but you brought it up, and so I got on my soapbox.
Okay.
Could I ask?
Yes, go ahead.
If you just tell us what you want these headings to be, we'll make that happen. I'll be honest, outside coming in, it is confusing when you look at our policies. Some have different headlines than
Right,
others.
depending on what year we updated it.
Now that Mr. Diazio is also reviewing them, he's using language that he's used to, which is probably maybe more aligned to PSBA, maybe not, I'm not sure. And then, PSBA uses different ones for different reasons. So if you just tell us what you want exactly to be,
Right.
I will make a note and we'll make sure that we try to consistently apply them each time we review. So
Well-
am I hearing authority or no?
So we are saying authority says where we derive the authority from.
That's what I wrote down.
Okay, that's what it is, and purpose is gone, which I think you knew purpose was gone. And then authority is, where does it fall in line? We start with authority?
It's the first.
So when we discussed the numbering scheme a couple of years ago, we also discussed having consistent sections for all these things that would always be the same number. So, you know, authority would always be, I don't remember what number we said, but probably didn't have authority. But, you know, delegation responsibility would always be section 6 or whatever it was. Even if you didn't need one, then you just skip 6, you know, but just so delegation responsibility was always 6. We haven't, we said we were going to do that, but we haven't actually done that.
Okay.
So if we're going to try to normalize these things, that's an opportunity to do that as well.
So content-wise, these policies are fine. I was just looking them over and I'm like, oh, we didn't bring them up to date with that. So not a hill I'm going to die on, but maybe something we can work on in the next few months of like all getting on, like, this is how we're going to do it.
So am I hearing correctly? Number 1 is authority, number 2 is definitions, 3 is delegation of responsibilities, and 4 is guidelines.
Yeah. And I did see a policy out there that had also had like general like there might be a few exceptions, general prohibitions or something. where
I
you-
would actually switch guidelines and delegation. Delegation is sort of the last thing. Well,
Really?
reference is the last thing, but
and
delegation
this-
is where we say, you know, so these are the statements the school board is making and guidelines, and then this is the stuff we're saying we need more, we need the administration to provide more detail on.
Just for
So-
painstaking clarity, that's sequential. It doesn't necessarily correspond to numbers because definitions is not only necessary. So we're talking about
Right, my
sequential.
suggestion would be if there aren't any necessary if definitions is, I'm making a number up, number 3, and some policy doesn't need definitions, you skip number 3. So that whatever follows it, if it's, you know, if it's guidelines is always 4, then guidelines is always 4, period. So not guidelines is sometimes 3 and guidelines is sometimes 4.
Okay.
But I'm not going to die on that hill either. I
Okay,
mean, I've
okay.
lost most of these fights over the years, so.
And again, we'll do whatever the board's will is. I will be, I know that Mr. Diazio had a conversation with some of you about the whole numbering piece as well.
Just that he didn't like it.
Can I just ask a question then? So if we look at 216, all the stuff that's currently under authority, we're moving that or not moving that?
Well, I mean, when I look at 216.
And if so, where are we
right-
moving it to?
Yeah, well, first off, it starts off with the purpose, which we were saying we're not doing purpose. So that would be gone. Yeah, that's what I mean. It's under authority. 1.1 under authority is the purpose, which would get rid of. Then we weren't getting rid of authority. We were just saying the authority is supposed to say where we get our power to do this.
So the statements, so 1.2 and 1.3 are the meat of the policy. They say, the board is saying, actually, it's just recognizing, 1.2 doesn't say anything either. 1.3 is an actual statement of policy. The board is saying that parents and guardians and eligible students 18 years of older will be notified annually of something. That's a statement of policy, and that should, in my background in policy making, the actual statement, the section that would go in is called statements of policy. But guidelines is what we seem to be using for statements of policy, so go under guidelines. 1.2 is meaningless. I mean, we're required to do all those things because they're in school code, so legal requirements. We don't have to say that we recognize legal requirements. We always just recognize legal requirements. There's not a problem with saying we do, but it doesn't actually mean anything.
Okay, so for these policies, and the ones that I called out, I think we can leave them. There's nothing wrong with the substance of them. It's just, now that we've had this conversation, I realize we need to sit down and kind of come up with a format that we're all comfortable with.
And again, I'm fine with leaving that, but if we are going to make changes going forward, like on the example of 1.2 on 216, that's where all the citations are to the legal authority. So
You're done. Your time's up.
4 minutes have expired.
the question may be then, where do those footnotes get moved, or do we need some kind of statement in every policy, as stupid as it may sound, that this is derived from school code, see footnotes 8? I mean, I
So
feel
there's
like
a references section. It's actually not late. It's just labeled legal in this one, where all those citations are at the bottom.
Well, I know, and I guess my only caution is that if in future policies, we're going to try to move things around per this numbering session or paragraphing parameters, we can't lose track of the legal references if they're in a section we're now going to be moving around. And I guess the point of me saying all this is to say, on a certain level, as long as it's in the policy, which is important, I don't want us to like recreate the wheel and especially create too much work for the administration in redoing stuff. That's just kind of my thought, that I don't want to make substance over, or form over substance is the right way to say it. Like, let's just be careful. I'm not saying we can't change things, but it's just a caution.
Yeah, I mean,
hear
on
you.
the particular question of citations, if they're, technically they're not necessary at all because we're obligated to follow them, period. But if we're going to have them, they're there in the legal section, which says that we recognize them because we put them in there. I don't know that they need to be in line, or this is just sort of a bucket list of, you know, here's all our citations that we stuck under the authority section. If they're really in line, they would go with the thing that they're referencing. I think 1.2 and all of its citations are meaningless, and we don't need to have that in any policy. But if you disagree, we should discuss it.
I'll just comment, when we send them off to PSBA, they're going to send them back with the citations in line where they belong in the line. That's their standard practice. Again, we can remove them or tell them we don't want them to do that and note them at the bottom. Yeah, there's PSBA, there's what Upper Dublin wants to do. You know, each district might do it slightly differently.
Okay. So we're just going to think about this. Moving on. Yeah, oh, you had something to add?
So, again, I don't know where we're going to land with this and how that's going to affect moving things to second reading and so on and so forth. But just if I follow the kind of line that Mr. Sirota was going down, then, I mean, I would think 1.1 would go. 1.2 to me kind of, again, if authority is the, you know, why do we have this policy? Why do we have the authority to have it? Maybe 1.2 is that authority. And to me, 1.3 is the guideline, actually, because that's not our authority. 1.3 isn't speaking to our authority to have a policy like this. It's saying what we want to have happen. So I don't know. I don't know if how do we just table it without, because I don't know how you're going to know how to present these for legislative, you know?
Yeah, well, what I was saying, because I was the one originally brought this up, is like, there's nothing wrong, like the substance of these policies is fine. And I was just saying we could reformat because that would not be a substantive change. But after the discussion, it's
This
more
one is second reading.
complicated.
Leave it alone,
Yeah.
it's second reading.
So
We'll
it's
do it
just,
right
yeah,
going
it's
forward.
more complicated than I originally thought. And I think we can just leave it as is, because I'm fine with everything, the information that's in there. It was just the format, but it's a bigger project than I originally conceived. Okay. Stan.
Can the policy committee meet and just come up with formatting conventions to propose to the board?
We can't, we have to meet in public.
I think technically, I mean, if it's not substantive, we probably could discuss that if it's really just about format. You know, maybe Ed might have a recommendation, but I don't, you know, I mean, it would just drag out a policy committee meeting a bit longer to do it. So maybe, you know, if we have a light education agenda or don't have an executive session after one, that's it.
I wonder too if your policy committee members maybe could share their thoughts with you individually via email. And then when we meet for agenda planning, maybe that's something, and you could maybe prepare, here's a suggestion based upon the feedback you got from them, and you could share it with them individually. As long as it's individual emails, it's not really deliberation. And I think maybe through planning, our agenda planning, we could.
Okay. Okay. So Jenna, you had other comments?
Not many, I promise. So if we can rewind to 002. So in 2.1, this language largely comes from statute, but it doesn't actually fully track the statute. So what the statute says is, and I forget which of the references it is, but our responsibility is to, quote, establish, equip, furnish, and maintain schools. Those are the, action words that they use in the statute. In the third line of 2.1, it includes the word operate. We don't actually operate the school, and it's not in the code, so I would recommend taking the word operate out. And then I think this can be simplified. Again, that's not a hill I'm gonna die on, but at the beginning where it says the board shall establish, that's, I think, where it should say establish, equip, furnish, and maintain, because that's what the statute says. Actually, I do know which one. I wrote it down. It's 501. The other comment I had here is, and this is out of the statute, that it's between the ages of 6 and 21. So that's our obligation, but as we know, we do operate schools for ages 5 and up. So I didn't know if that's something we want to change, because that's what we actually do. Our obligation is only for 6, but again, we all know that we operate kindergarten, which includes age 5. So I don't know if that's a question for Mr. Diazio. I mean, when I first read it, I thought that must be a typo, but now I see where it comes from. But again, it's not what we actually do. It's in 2.1 of 002. And that is, Pennsylvania law only requires us to operate 6 and up. It's discretionary for under 6, but again, we currently exercise that discretion, so.
I believe that his recommendation, or in reviewing this, did not change it to 5 and left it at 6 is because that's what required, so that in the event the district should want to change their mind at some point, policy's not locking you into having to provide for 5. Now, maybe the board wants to say they want to be locked into that, and we could change it. I also moved your language as you suggested, if you're comfortable with that, if it reads right.
Yep, that looks great. I mean, my view is, if we were actually gonna, nobody freak out, we're not saying this here, but if we were ever gonna say, we're gonna get rid of kindergarten, that would be something we would definitely have heavy discussion about, I would think. And, that then would include, I would think, changing this back to 6. I don't know. It's out of sync to me that yeah, I mean, again, for me, having read it for the first time, I literally assumed it must be a typo. So I would sort of recommend changing it to 5, because that is what we do. And to the extent there would ever be a decision sometime in the future when I'm not on this board to to get rid of kindergarten, then you would change it to 6. Yep. Oh yeah.
I think it's because we're required to educate kids 6 and over. So it might just be reflecting the fact that kindergarten's not compulsory and people can opt out of it, but they can't opt out of the older grades. So that might have more to do with that.
This is saying what the board shall do. The board shall establish. It doesn't say anything about what families will do, but or must do. I will say that in 2015, when we reviewed this policy, at the time it said ages of 9 and 21, or 9 and something, because compulsory age was 9. And I remember asking this same question, and because that's weird. Why are we only doing age 9? That's obviously wrong. So I agree, it's confusing. I mean, I think we could say explicitly that these are a reflection of school code, and have a statement of policy, if we wish, that the board is actually establishing schools for those ages 5 and up, that would be clearer. But whether the clarity is actually a problem that needs solving, I'm not sure I'm persuaded about.
I can ask Mr. Diazio if he feels strongly that it needs to remain 6, or if he's fine with us changing it if he'd like.
I think also if we were to put it at 5, then that sort of adds one more threshold if anybody would ever want to change it, right? I mean, it makes it more explicit if we were to change it. And for that reason, I think it might be a good thing then to put it in as 5,
Well,
because that's our current reality and that's how we operate.
okay, I have a thought. So sometimes you have a child that would turn 5, but they wouldn't be 5 by the start of school. So that would be problematic. September 15th, I think. So maybe that's why it's 6. Right? Yeah, I could see where that might be the issue. Okay. So, anything else with this? What else do you have, Jenna?
Only other thing I had was pretty minor, but it's in 2.3. I think it's a typo. I'm sorry, I'm on 003. My apologies. So in 003, paragraph 2.3, the third line says, provided the superintendent or other administration does not routinely delegate. I think it's supposed to say administrator. Pretty minor. And I had the same note that you did about there being a purpose in 137, but we already talked about that. Oh, sorry, I had one other thing, small. 137.1, paragraph 2.2, talks about home education students being able to participate in extracurriculars. So it says only at the school building the student would be assigned to. I mean, I think I know what we're saying there. We're obviously saying, you know, it's, if, let's say you're elementary, right, it would be whatever extracurriculars are at Jarretttown, if you're a Jarretttown, you know, in that catchment. But it makes it sound like you literally can only do it, because it says at the school building. Maybe its use of the word building makes it sound, I think, more limiting than we mean, but that may come from statute as well. So that was my only question, is kind of, it literally makes it sound like you can only do things at Jarretttown, even though it could be an event that's taking place at Sandy Run for Jarretttown students, if that makes any sense. It's not a big deal. It jumped out to me as being a little odd. But I think what we're saying here, and let's just make sure we agree on that, is it's not literally at the building. It's, you know, it's activities offered by the school that the student would be attending, right?
It's actually activities offered to students at the building where this student would be assigned. Not about the location, it's about who it's offered to.
Jeff?
I'm sorry, I've been puzzling through something. Can we go back to Jenna's comment on 002 about the word operate? And I just want to make sure I understand. So I know that word isn't in the statute as a shall, but then the statute says we can satisfy our duty by operating a building. So by taking operating out, are we in any way harming ourselves or limiting ourselves? Meaning, establish a building. Okay, well, this building already exists. It's established. It's equipped. It's furnished. And does maintain have a physical characteristic to the word that's different than operating? Now, we would still maintain it as well, because we couldn't not maintain a building. But I just wanted to make sure, Jenny, you were comfortable with taking operating out, or make sure we all are, based on that's a way we can satisfy that duty. And my guess is that's how the word got into the policy. I don't know that it's necessary, but I just wanted us to noodle through that.
As I read the school code, so section 501, A, as Jenna says we must establish, equip, and furnish and maintain. Then B says the ways we can do that are the following. And without enumerating all of those ways, I think we're good. We're just saying we will, it's using operation as a way of accomplishing A. So as long as we're accomplishing A by one of these 4 methods, we're good. We have established, equipped, furnished, and maintained. But I don't think we need to operate. Unless there's some other, unless we want to be specific that we're going to do it by B1 and not B2, B3, and B4.
I mean, I think B1 is how we do it in practicality and reality, but I guess you're right. We don't need to necessarily call that out. Okay.
Well, we actually probably occasionally do B4 on a student by student rare circumstance basis, which is, for those not following along, paying tuition for students residing in our school district to attend another school district. And I know it's happened the other way, that other districts have paid us for that purpose at least. So,
And I guess also to answer my own question, the statute really doesn't define operate either. So I'm making mountains over molehills, and not a hill I will die on, to use the phrase of the evening.
Okay. I have one more about this. It sort of overlaps with another section we're going into before we leave these second readings, which is, so since we're here, I'm just going to draw your attention to it. On 003, under executive functions, I think it's 2.2. So the superintendent or designee shall be responsible for the preparation of administrative regulations for the operation of the district that are consistent with the law and dictated by the policies. And I'm going to skip ahead. Administrative regulations. This is the last sentence. The superintendent or designee shall inform the board when changes are made to administrative regulations. So in the past, we paid a lot of attention to what was in the policy because we didn't have a lot of control over the administrative regulations. So we have a policy in the new section where we're taking everything that's in the policy and putting it in the administrative regulations. So I just want to bring that to the board's attention, because when we do that, when we take something out of the policy, put it in the administrative regulations, we don't have control over it anymore. We're just going to be informed. Other districts, I pulled like 3 random districts, and they do it different ways, where they have to approve it or they have the right to rescind an administrative regulation if they don't like it. So I just wanted to put that in your minds as we go forward to one of the future policies. Which one is? And does anybody have any thoughts on that now? Because
I can give a little historical context to that particular language. When I first got on the board, so sometime in the last 10 years, when I got on the board, it didn't say that. The board was also responsible for the administrative regulations, and so the policy committee would be responsible basically for writing all of it, obviously with the help of the superintendent, but we would actually approve all of it. And so there was a question about what's the difference between policy and administrative regulation. And so I think there's some historical reason why that happened, which I can discuss another time. I don't need to get into it now, but we normalized it to say the policy is what the board is directing, and the administrative regulation is how the superintendent and team will implement. So the only thing we retained was, if that's going to change, we want to hear about it, but we don't have control over it. So the way we do have control over it is, if we don't like something in an administrative regulation, we can go through the policy process to modify the policy to say that the administrative regulation shall say this or shall not say that, or just put it in policy directly, which is a heavyweight and cumbersome process, deliberately, for good reason. But if the board wanted to go a different direction, we could go a different direction. But that's how we landed here.
Right, so as we know, it's like months for us to change something in policy. So that's why I think sometimes we have stuff in policy and we keep it there because, you know, to move it to the AR, it could change and it would take us a few months to change it back if it wasn't what we thought was a good fit for the community. So go ahead.
I mean, the only thing I would add is if you were to say to me, gosh, Laurie, we don't like AR 206, could you look at it? I'm not going to say, well, you got to bring it back to policy meeting. We're going to wait now until it goes to first reading and second reading. I'll say, absolutely. What are your concerns? Let's look at it. We might give you another draft. What do you think about that? Give us some feedback on it. So, you know, we of course would want to work with you. My experience is the way this is written, that you write the policy, we do the AR, and we certainly seek your feedback. We share it with you like we're doing now with first and second reading, or like I still have 915 that we told you we would be doing the AR. I'm working on a draft for that. When it's ready, we'll certainly share that to get feedback.
And I mean, sometimes when so we keep something in the policy, it also helps the administration, because if there's just one person who's really passionate about something and they know they only have to get the superintendent to change their mind, you know, that could be a struggle. So when you have to get 9 people, when you have to convince 9 people that something needs to be changed, so it's, you know, it serves many purposes.
Yeah, well, the other purpose is for doing it any different ways. You know, Lori says, well, of course we would work with you. You know, we're not going to, you know, if you don't like it, just tell us and we'll, but not every board is homogenous and not every board actually has a great relationship with their superintendent at all times. So that's part of the power struggle between the policy and the AR. And I'd like to think that, I mean, right now we have, and have had for a very long time, a great relationship with our superintendents through many cycles of board members. And one would hope that goes forward, but part of the process is protecting against other things that can happen.
And I would suggest you put in policy things that you feel strongly about and language that you want absolutely should be in policy. And then that's what we have to abide by in the AR. Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I think I get like why we're concerned about the one sentence about the superintendent making the changes and then informing us when sometimes we're making the changes in AR, like moving something there. So if we want to articulate that we're able to do that rather than, because here it sounds just like the superintendent's
Right. Are we asking the superintendent to put it in the AR, or is the board actually putting it in the AR?
Right.
That's the difference?
Well, I don't know. It sounds like,
Yeah.
well, sometimes we put it in and it doesn't say that we do that. Or we're at, you know.
Right. So my point of bringing it up is to like think carefully when we move something from like say, oh, this belongs in the AR. Because once it goes into the AR, like we don't have control over it, and then it could take a long time for, like, you know, months for us to get it, you know, theoretically. And so I just wanted to hear people's, if they're comfortable with that the way it is. If we want to change this is going to take months. This is how it is right now. So it's, which one? I'm sorry, my notes are late. Well,
Yeah, there was one of the data retention policies where we basically moved the entire thing into
oh, it was
AR.
data retention. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we get there, that's just something to keep in mind. But
And the last thing I'm just going to add is I think we're going through a bit of growing pains because we've now inserted our solicitor in reviewing the policies, which I do think is a good best practice for us to have. However, I think there's a different philosophy in what belongs in policy versus AR than maybe this board has had. So again, if the board wants it a certain way, we'll provide that feedback to Mr. Diazio and let him know we really want to keep certain things there. And he again needs to get accustomed to what our practice is here as well. So I just think some of it's growing pains.
okay. Okay, so with that, are we comfortable moving the second readings on to the legislative? Okay, so we'll move that forward and we'll go on to First readings, local policy review.
Okay, second readings, get excited. 907, visitors to schools were reviewed, both this and AR, both reviewed by our district solicitor, recommended some additional language regarding health, safety, welfare, and prohibition of recording devices. So any questions on this policy, this first reading?
Jenna's ready. Go ahead, Jenna.
So this will actually be really apropos to what you just said. So when I read 907, my reaction was that some of this feels like AR language. You know, just some examples, right? Like 3.1, you know, persons wishing to visit should make arrangements in advance. I mean, that, frankly, it sounds a lot like what's in the AR for 907.1, which is a similar policy that deals with classroom observations. And that, you know, again, I'm fine either way. I guess it feels like a level of detail that we don't necessarily need to dictate at the board level. You know, upon arrival, visitors must register at the office. I mean, again, I think what we're trying to say in policy is, you know, we're, as it says here, right, we're happy to have visitors, but there have to be some, you know, ground rules about it so it doesn't interfere with the, you know, the classroom day. That's, you know, kind of what we're saying. But yeah, some of this, when we get into the nitty gritty, I don't know that we are necessarily dictating as the board. I certainly don't have a problem with it staying in the policy because I actually agree with all of it. So again, it's kind of form over substance, I'll admit, but I do think philosophically we got to get more consistency with what's the level of detail that we're dictating as the board versus what is really ultimately AR.
I think just to that point, my interpretation is when the board really cares about specific details or guidelines, it's reflected in policy of like, so in AR, we would not want an AR that doesn't, for instance, have the specifics of signing in and having a badge, et cetera.
Okay, so speaking of 907, so you are wondering if we want to keep it there. Sounds like Stu says, yes, let's keep it there. I'm okay with keeping it there. Do you have anything else on that? I have something if you want to keep looking on.
No, I didn't have anything else on 907.
Okay. Dr. Thomas, did you have an opinion on that since it was, I mean, I'm okay with keeping that much detail in that policy.
I think with safety issues, like really spelling things out, and it, like, that's like the most important thing is keeping kids safe, and that's explicitly stated in policy seems to be okay to me.
Okay. I had a question about 907. Would we put any language in there about what visitors are allowed to bring into school or not bring into school?
I believe in the AR, it says must follow all practices, procedures, laws. I can pull up, but I believe that's what
I mean, I know it talks about definitely the photos is in there.
Like I said, I know that it speaks to it in the AR. In the AR, under district and staff responsibility, number 8, failure on the part of visitors to comply with district policy, procedure, and rules shall result in more limited access. So, I mean, there is an expectation that all visitors must comply with district policy, procedure, and rules.
do we have, since we're on the AR right now, do we have a safety and security coordinator or designee in every building?
We have an overall safety and security coordinator.
Okay, because it did say if somebody comes, like somebody comes to the building and they don't have photo ID, then the safety coordinator will decide if they can go in.
Yep.
So if the safety coordinator's not in that building,
They can be reached. They can be called.
they can call,
Yeah,
okay, that's
yep.
how it would work.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Go ahead.
So again, just to play devil's advocate, if we feel strongly about some of the language staying in 907, then you may want to have a look then at what is in 907.1, which is a fairly similar policy that we just approved via second reading, because some of that kind of detail, for example, about recording, is actually in the AR for 907.1. So I'm just kind of pointing out we're treating them somewhat inconsistently. I can be fine either way, but again, if what I hear folks saying is, well, that kind of safety language is important, then we may want to have a conversation about taking that out of the 907.1 AR and moving it to the policy. I just noticed they're very similar, not identical, but they're similar topics. But there is a difference in my view between what we've relegated to AR in 907, which we're talking about right now, versus 907.1 that we just talked about.
Was that safety in 907.1, the classroom observations?
Well, I mean, the recording, for example, you know, that's in the AR for 907.1, but it's in the policy for 907, just as an example.
Right. That would be like
And it's-
someone who
there's-
has permission, to me, that they're not like the same level. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
we're like,
there's-
might be letting. a
There's language
stranger
about,
come.
you know, you have to remain in such locations that are designated. I mean, I would argue there's some safety-related language in 907.1 that, again, is in the AR. And I'm actually fine either way, because I agree, safety's a pretty paramount concern. So it's just something to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, my philosophy is that there are certain things that need to be in the policy, even though they sound like AR on occasion, safety being one of them, because we want to be really specific sometimes. So I'm okay with there being a little inconsistency with the classroom observation and the letting visitors in the building. Other committee? Agree, disagree? You're okay with those differences? Okay. So back to, 907. Any other thoughts or comments on 907? Okay. Then we are going to move on.
351, substance abuse. This was brought up mostly, so we reviewed with our solicitor. We're recommending that the addition of guideline language to conform to practice, as well as the update. There was a 5-day language, and state law says that there needs to be a report within 72 hours. So that's the main reason we wanted to bring this forward, but just wanted to make sure there weren't any other questions.
I have a couple. In our favorite section, authority. In 2.1, there's just something that kind of nagged at me here. It's at the very end where it says, you know, of course, we're concerned about misuse of drugs by employees, clearly. But then it says, especially as the use relates to an employee's safety, efficiency, and productivity. So, I mean, I would argue it's not just the employee's safety, it's everybody's safety. So I might just strike the word employees and just say safety. You know, the efficiency and productivity sounds a little odd to me, to be totally honest, but I'm fine with it staying in there. But I think we want to be clear. We're not just talking about concerns about the employee safety. It's everybody, you know, students, other staff, et cetera. Then there was another section in 3.1. Talks about we're going to have a statement notifying employees that the unlawful, and then it has some words that I don't necessarily need the word unlawful to modify or to mean, manufacture, distribution, dispensing, like that, I don't want that lawful or unlawful. I don't know if you could even have it lawfully. It just struck me as a little odd that we're saying, it's just the unlawful manufacture, distribution, dispensing. I mean, we don't want that of any way, shape, or form in our schools. Now, clearly, then I think when you get to possession or use, you could have lawful possession or use, so I'm fine with unlawful modifying those words, but no, lawful or unlawful, to the extent such a thing exists, manufacture, distribution, dispensing, absolutely not.
So we're recommending removing the word unlawful right here in 3.1.
I would move it before the words possession or use. So I would say a statement notifying employees that the manufacture, distribution, or dispensing or unlawful possession or use of controlled substances. That makes sense.
Comfortable with that, Ms.
That makes
Kitten?
sense.
Okay.
Go ahead.
This is one of those places where a comma delimited list doesn't work. So as it reads right now, it says unlawful manufacture and then distribution. It doesn't explicitly say unlawful distribution, so this could be interpreted that in unlawful only applies to manufacture. And the same thing happens if you move unlawful to possession. So you might, if you really want it there, you can remove it from where it is and say unlawful possession or unlawful use to be clear, because otherwise use is not clearly modified by unlawful. Or you could not do this with a comma delimited list and do it with bullets or some other structure that actually is clearer. It is also possible that this comes out of some other, probably not school code specifically, but something in Pennsylvania law.
I don't know, can you think of anything where someone may do this lawfully and be separate from their
Well, it's
school
not
law?
about the doing. This is a statement notifying employees of. So it would be something about employment law that you have to notify employees.
And I think my point is, I can't envision a situation where even if there is a lawful way to manufacture, distribute, or dispense controlled substances, I don't want it happening in our schools. So, and I think it's our right to say that.
No, you're absolutely right. So the statement here, right? So, and we do have these situations frequently, right? You can be prescribed a controlled substance. You can't have it in the school, right? So, no. Well, we're talking about employees, right? We're talking about employees. So that it's different than students. So I feel comfortable moving that word there. We can, wordsmith and play around with the list.
Ms. Kitten and Ms. Evans, does it read how is acceptable now? Or unlawful possession or unlawful use of controlled substance? That, okay. I do think we do want to make sure everybody understands this is a policy related to employees. And if you noticed in the chart in the agenda as well, we are trying to move all of the policies related to employees into the 300s. So we would be repealing, I think it was 451 and 551 that were broken out into like admin professionals and different professionals as well.
Okay.
I'm just a little bit concerned that we're losing the point. The point of this statement is, the point of this section is it binds the district to make a statement to employees about two things, about all the controlled substance stuff and the actions that would be taken. It's about making a statement. And so if we are also, are we trying to dictate exactly what needs to be in that statement, or does something in the law dictate what has to be in that statement? That
There's no law that I'm aware of that dictates what the statement is.
okay. Is there a law that says we have to make a statement at all?
Not to my knowledge as your HR director.
Yeah.
Best practice, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem binding us to doing that, but it's putting a requirement on us that is if it's not required by law, we're just adding a requirement on ourselves. But I don't think it's a problematic requirement.
Okay. Jeff?
Three things. To Mark's point, I think we should keep in the notice provision because we do say later on that we'll make a good faith effort to continue to maintain a drug-free workplace. And part of the reason to do that is to put out the notice. Second point, to that end, the definition of drug-free workplace mirrors the notification language. So I think we have to change the unlawful word in that definition also to be consistent. I don't have the number in front of me. Again. Yeah. And then my broad question is, there's certain places in the policy that talk about either convictions or possession of substances in the workplace, and some places do not. And I'm wondering, is that purposeful or something we need to catch? And so, like, I'll give you my example. If we go to authority in 2.3 and 2.4, in 2.3, we're requiring that the employees be notified that they blah, 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 and they have to notify us of any criminal drug statute conviction in the workplace within 72 hours. But then in 2.4, it says, an employee convicted of delivery or possession of a controlled substance with the intent to deliver shall be terminated. So if you're convicted of delivery off-site, you're terminated. I just want to make sure, like, are we limiting it to workplace or not? Or is that consistent or inconsistent, I guess is my question.
2.3 should not have in the workplace. It should be any conviction for a violation.
Yep, right, that makes more sense.
And that would then be consistent with 3.2, which is we have to notify the grantor of federal funds if we get notice of any conviction. Would that be correct? Yeah, okay.
Okay. Anything else on these? 351, yeah. 451, 551.
So I'm fine with those, but just before we move off of this set of first readings, were we supposed to bring back 206?
206, yes, was on for first reading. We had tabled it back to this meeting. I had spoken to Ms. Ionetti as we prepared the agenda, and given the length of this current agenda and the fact that we had spring break and there were some meetings that I wanted to hold with some community members, that was not able to happen. So we just tabled it until next month.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, we are moving to our first readings for legal PSBA policy, News Network, or PNN. So first on this section of the agenda is 800 records management, reviewed by solicitor. The majority of existing policy language, this is the one that we were talking about earlier, has been removed and incorporated into the AR and record retention chart. And that AR is included as well. So any thoughts, feelings? Questions?
Wait, let me ask the committee first. Committee, Mark is ready. Go ahead, Mark. We'll come back to the committee.
One minor one, the attachment should be a PDF, not a proprietary file format. Not everyone has the software to read that.
Can you say
Sorry,
that
it's probably
again?
in the AR. It's in the AR.
Oh, you're in the AR? Okay.
Yeah, it's the schedule of record deletion. It's not.
This attachment
Yeah,
here?
I'm not comfortable with assuming that everyone owns a particular piece of software.
It should be right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And also in that AR, this has needed work for a long time. And this is another one, for some reason, I've never been able to get traction on. I kind of wish Prakash had hung out for this meeting. But up at the top of the attachment, well, okay, so the policy does a really good job now of talking about data and records as just data and records, not whether they're physical or not physical. But necessarily the AR and specifically the deletion policy does talk about what media the records are stored on, but it doesn't do a very good job of deletion for electronic records. So it talks about special handling, regular handling and special handling for destruction of paper records, but gets really confused when it talks about regular deletion or special deletion for electronic records. That's in the AR. I mean, in the attachment.
And I do,
So
I have a note.
finally, the policy and the AR do a good job of this, but the attachment still needs attention there.
I have a note from a conversation with Mr. Diazio to, he did mention that we do need to add to the chart, but the board would need to decide on this, the retention of emails. So I don't know if that goes to your
emails
point or
too.
not,
Yeah.
but.
So if you look at the attachment, at the top it lists 4 different types of disposal codes, as they're called, and routine handling, special handling for destruction of paper records. But delete, it just says delete, and if you just like delete a file on a computer, it's trivial to get it back. You delete it, you move it to the trash, empty the trash. That didn't actually really do anything. It's not hard. But if you want to really delete something, like special handling where they need to be shredded, or any method that reduces it to an illegible condition, they're the same thing for the same records. If they're stored electronically, we're just deleting them, and that's not okay. So we need to do a better job of all the records that need special handling when they're on paper. They need special handling when they're electronic too.
So are you proposing to add something to the policy?
Yeah, well, no, the AR and the policy now do a good job of talking about that, but the attachment doesn't reflect any of that.
Okay.
So, Mr. Sirota, you'd like to see some different language down here under number 4 for deleting that is about special handling of electronic
I think there need
records.
to be 2 categories for deletion of electronic records, just like there are 2 categories for deletion of paper records, or just talk about the data and not about how it's stored, and recognize that some things can be just sort of crumpled up and thrown in the trash can, and some things have to be shredded electronically or on paper.
Go ahead.
Mark, I'm just curious, how do you feel though about the fact that the policy itself has almost nothing in it now? This is 800. And really everything is now, including the attachment that you're referencing, it's all in the AR. Like if you actually read what's left in the policy itself, it's like nothing.
I'm okay with,
There actually aren't even any guidelines.
yeah, I think that's okay because the records that we're talking about, and they are talked about in detail in the AR and also in 830, are governed by various state and federal laws. And as long as we're adhering to those laws, I don't think we need to be explicit about what the board is stipulating, other than that we will respect things like personal information appropriately. Now it's easy to say that, and in the reality, for instance, we don't have a lot of HIPAA data, but but HIPAA's rules around this kind of stuff are really also very vague. And then there's an attachment to HIPAA called the HIPAA security rule that talks about some of the stuff in more detail, and it too is vague. And the real way it gets enforced is that auditors, who typically companies hire to make sure you do this, have their own rules about what it takes to meet the HIPAA rules. And those auditors are just making it up, and they're not actually made by security personnel, and they don't know what they're talking about. Oftentimes, they just say, for example, and not for record deletion, but for an example, for authentication requirements, they'll say passwords have to be changed every 30 days, even though that is not actually more secure than not changing your password every 30 days. But auditors made that on a checklist somewhere, and so everyone just does it because the auditor said you had to, not because the law is specific about it. And so the law is not really specific enough about this stuff, and that's understandable because technology changes every day. But I think our responsibility is to meet the law, and we do, and we don't even need to say so explicitly in policy because it's the law.
So you're saying we don't need this policy at all? Is that what you're saying?
I think we do need a policy that says administrative regulations will be created that stipulate we will destroy things when they need to be destroyed, because that's not actually in the law. And I think it is important to destroy things when they need to be destroyed, so that if somewhere down the road someone says, well, what about, do you have any records on this? We can legitimately say no.
Well, there's also a security reason to do that too, which is
Yeah.
if we hang on to things forever, less concerned about paper, but now that things are, pretty much all digital, if we hold on to something longer than we have to, it actually does create additional risk from, heaven forbid, any type of cyber attack. If you don't have it, somebody can't hack it. If we have it, we're keeping it longer than we need to. So I don't know, Mark, if that's something we actually want to say in the policy, that, I think it's important from a policy standpoint to get rid of things when we can to help eliminate that risk.
I'd be very happy to have a statement of policy that says we will hold on to data no longer than it is necessary to hold on to it. And I would expand that further to say we will not collect data that we do not need. We may have some old form that says, please provide your social security number, and we don't actually need it, but that form's been around forever, and so people just keep supplying it. We should have a policy that says we won't collect data we don't need.
So then, practically speaking, for 2.1, you're looking at, in the second half of the paragraph, what information, documents, et cetera, should be retained, need not be retained in accordance with applicable law. Would the suggestion be to explicitly call out what must be deleted then in accordance with applicable law?
I'd sort of spin it around, yes, but I would sort of spin it around and say records will be held no longer than necessary to comply with whatever we need to comply with, and records will not be collected unless they are necessary for the operation of the district, or some such wording.
That sounds reasonable. Okay. Any other comments on this one? Okay. Moving on.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
1.1, do we need that? It felt out of place. The district receives and generates volumes of information in both electronic and hard copy form. Not all of it constitutes a record. It felt odd to me in the policy.
Yeah, it's the purpose. I mean,
Right?
Yeah.
yeah.
No, we don't.
I'd probably get rid of 1.1.
I'd probably get rid of the whole purpose section.
Yeah, and 1.2 too. The purpose.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, I'd be fine with that.
So you want 1.1 and 1.2 removed? Do you want, so 2.1 covers it, developing the admin reg?
With the additions that Jenna, Stu, and I were just discussing, and I don't think we need to wordsmith it now, but you can propose something to bring back to us.
I took some notes, we can do that.
Okay. We really mean it this time, right? We're
Yes.
moving on to the next one. Okay, next one.
Cited for 830, security of computerized personal information, breach notification. So also reviewed by solicitor. Act 151 amended, breach of personal information notification act definitions were amended, along with notification methods, and additionally some data storage and transmission policy requirements were included. So any thoughts or questions?
So this is 830, not to be confused with 830.1. Okay, 830. Anyone? Mark's ready. Go, Mark.
It's actually a pretty small one. I mean, there's a lot in here, and I think, to Jenna's point, this might be more than is necessary for board policy, but I am a little bit confused by the language in 4.3, which is at the very bottom. it says the district shall provide notice of the breach. So we're talking about in case where there is some sort of security compromise, what notice we will provide. It says we shall provide notice if any of these three things are true. Do we have to provide in the notice what happened? So which of these three things? I'm not sure if this policy is just saying you'll provide notice, the same notice that it talks about above, or is it trying to say that you need to be specific about what happened here, which of these three things? It's ambiguous to me, and I think it could be clearer.
Since that's cited, that it's direct language.
I did not check.
4.3.
So it says, so 4.1 says, will provide notice to the district attorney and to anyone whose personal information was compromised. 4.3 says, we will also provide that notice if the data is accessed and acquired in an unencrypted form, is one. If the security breach is linked to a breach of the security of the encryption, is two. Or if the security breach involves a person with access to the encryption key. It seems, if it's just saying you'll provide notice, then there's no point. The note, it was compromised, so I'm not sure if the purpose of it is to say how it was compromised, but then I don't understand why it's important to provide that.
You will be pleased or not to know that it is direct language from the
Yeah, and
statute.
legislators are really bad at making legislation. All right, well then I guess we have to stick with it, even though it's really kind of bizarre.
And the AR does call out what the notification has to include. Section 5, contact information, categories of information, so forth, specific elements that were breached.
And that is all out of the statute. Unfortunately, I'm familiar with this from my day job, so yeah, it's, yeah.
All right, we're ready to move on to 830.1.
830.1, new policy to develop to comply with new requirements of Act 151, as we were just talking about regarding policy addressing data encryption, security, and storage. Thoughts, comments, hopes, fears?
I have a quick question, not about the specifics of the policy, but attached to the agenda, we have a proposed policy 830.1, and then we have another document called security.pdf. I'm not clear what that is.
I can answer this, and Brooke,
Okay.
Brooke tried to fix this today, so if you're in the live agenda, it should be fixed. For whatever reason, board docs last Friday, I had them saved as 8:30 and the title, but when you uploaded them, it just called them security. I could not get it to fix, so it was some technology glitch, but I believe that you changed that today.
I
Yeah,
still
we
see
talked-
security.pdf.
We talked about it right
So-
this afternoon.
The short version is I should ignore the thing called security.pdf
Yes.
and look at the thing called
Yes,
830.1.
yeah,
Okay.
yep.
Thank you.
Okay. I can start. Do you have something ready to go, or I got something ready to go on this one? I'll go. 5.3, so 5.3 says consequences, and then 5.4, failure to comply with the law. Is that supposed to be one thing? 5.3 and 5.4? Or why does 5.3 just say consequences?
Looks like a
Just
copy
cut
paste.
5.3 and be done, right?
I think it's a copy paste problem.
Well, I'm wondering if it should be a separate section, because I was going to say that 5.4.1 and 5.4.2 talk about employees and volunteers, even though it's under service providers. So I think we either need to have a new heading or something, because
Yeah, I agree. I think consequences, everything from 5.3 on down is meant to be bullet 6, probably.
Oh, like not under service providers, just for,
And everything under the word consequences is about consequences, so it's probably just a section heading that got numbered.
Okay, so the section, if the section heading would be 6, consequences, and then everything would fall under that? My other, this was very specific in this about what the consequences were. We don't normally see that. Is there a reason? Like employees may be disciplined? And is there any reason that it's like very specific? Volunteers may be excluded? I don't think I've seen that in another policy where we say what the consequences are in the policy.
Definitely called out things like this. I don't know that we've ever had a heading specifically called that it's been that evident. Makes me wonder if there's a reason. So let me look.
Okay. I mean, I was really just curious. Don't normally see that. Okay, other comments about 830.1? Go ahead, Mark.
411, under guidelines, says that we have to have data security controls to ensure that only authorized individuals have access to computerized data. I don't know why the word computerized is there. Only authorized individuals have access to data is what I think we mean by that. And then, well, let's discuss that because my other one's not related. 411.
Is there anything to address if a student were to access information and they shouldn't? Did I see that or miss that?
This under.
This is in the 800s, so this
Yeah.
applies to students, applies to everybody.
Oh, okay.
But I think if you're asking about consequences, certainly there's a difference in how discipline is handled for different categories of people. And so if we're going to be explicit about, as Jenna said, it does seem weirdly specific. If we're going to be explicit in the consequences section, we're missing a category of people. But if we could just say, people will be disciplined according to the appropriate disciplinary procedure and obviate that.
Yeah, I mean, by listing the 3 groups, it does seem like you could imply that there's no consequences for somebody who's doesn't fit those categories. I don't know. It doesn't. Something else needs to be added or they need to be removed there.
I can ask Mr. Giazio, or if you want something included for students, I'd be very general that, students would be following the code of conduct.
Right, and I think realistically, employees will also be disciplined according to their disciplinary procedures. And so I don't know that we have explicit disciplinary procedures for volunteers or for businesses with whom we have a relationship, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I would go with that. We don't need to enumerate other policies in this policy. Back to 411, is everyone okay with striking the word computerized? Is there some value in having it there that I'm missing?
I think that's fine to get rid of that.
My next one is under 412, a plan for backup and recovery. It says data shall be securely maintained in separate physical locations or in separate data storage systems.
I just want to go back to that computerized data.
Yeah.
For some reason, an entity that maintains, stores, or manages computerized data is in the statute language.
So maybe this whole policy, even though it's not explicitly saying so, is talking about computerized data?
Why don't we ask that question more
Yeah,
specifically for you guys?
Because that would also, for 412.
Because if it's pushing that there, then I'm wondering if that's the intent.
Yeah, that's a good catch.
Let's
I
not
wonder.
go too far down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, let's find that out first, and then I'll review it again with that in mind if that's the case.
Okay, anything else on that one? Okay, moving on.
Okay, I know that Ms. Summers has been so excited to talk about 251 with you guys, so I'm actually going to let her do some talking. If you're good, I can pass you this mic.
Thank you. So a part of, back in 2022, there was a new law, a new section in the PA School Code, and it was entitled Assisting Students Experiencing Educational Instability. So from there, what happened, there was a PNN in 2023 that identified, that's replacing your current 251, which is homeless children and youth, with this new policy. So it all comes from PSBA. The big component of this policy really talks about a point of contact for families that are experiencing educational instability. You know, we're widening the definition as, because last it was just homelessness, so we're looking at, you know, some other components as well. So that was the big component of this policy, where you'll see a lot of it's within the AR as far as what this person will do. It also talks about, you know, graduation, and really has the overall feel of, we want to make sure nothing gets in the way of our students that are, you know, that are experiencing educational instability, to make sure that they can get access to everything that we have here. Another piece of this is that we are going through our McKinney-Vento homelessness audit next month. And a part of that audit is we need to be looking at this policy. So I wanted to make sure I could bring it to first reading, so that when we go through that audit next month, we can be talking about how we have this, you know, within a first read, and that we are looking to change it so it updates with the current school code. So with that, I know there's a lot of language in there. You know, I can try my best to answer as many questions as you can regarding, you know, the language within both the policy and the AR.
I have a content question first before we get into the language. Is that okay? Okay. Before we get into the language, I'm wondering if this policy, in your opinion, impacts students who've been hit by a natural disaster. So like when we had the tornado, that was many, many students all going to the, you know, it was one person. So what do we need to do policy-wise to make sure, if, God forbid, something like that happened again, that one person would be able to, or how do we support the person that's assigned to this who may get overwhelmed?
Well, so I think, you know, what's important in the policy, it designates a person, but it really is a village that does it. So in this, it actually denotes me as the contact. However, we work very closely with one of our middle school counselors who has a social work background as well, who actually is doing all of the information for the McKinney-Vento. So we use her. Chris Robbins is also doing the transportation component. We're talking with the school counselors in each building, because we'll provide them that information regarding the student. So I think we absolutely have the capacity. You know, it starts with me, but then I'm going and I'm channeling the people that would need to be involved, because it also talks about the confidentiality, to make sure that you're only really telling people that need to be involved in that because of, you know, the sensitive information. So I do think that the policy is written in such a way that we're able to do that. And I think that we could cover, you know, for the, you know, when that did happen, when we were, you know, twice the amount of people that were identified as homeless during that time, that we would be able to support those kids.
So you don't think there needs to be anything else in the policy
I don't think so.
for like any kind of contingency or anything?
No,
Okay.
I think we're okay.
Go ahead.
So in 5.1, it says, no, sorry, 1, yeah, is it 5.1? No, I'm in the wrong policy. It says 251, right at the bottom, the last section, 3.1 says, the board designates the director of student services. Is that something that, so what the law says is that the school entity shall designate somebody. It doesn't say the board has to designate somebody. So to your point, Jen, if we, you know, or Jen, if we have, you know, 300 students all at the same time who suddenly need somebody and they need a point of contact, if it's in policy, we're stuck because it takes us 2 months to change policy at a minimum. But we're not obligated to do it in policy. We could just say that part of the delegation of responsibility is that the superintendent shall name somebody and not do it ourselves. I'm comfortable with doing that, and it does provide that outlet, and it does meet the law I don't know there's a reason why we, the board, need to be specific that it's the Director of Student Services.
Yeah, I think we want to make sure that, I'm wondering if we could do both, where we could identify, they do in the school code note that they want to make sure they have one person of contact because it just makes it much easier to streamline. But I'm wondering if we
One
could-
per student, right? Not
that's
necessarily,
true.
not necessarily one per district.
Yeah, and think about it that way, but that is true. We could also add to that statement, the board designates the Director of Student Services as a director of point of contact, or if there is some way that we could put, identifies designee or designees, so that it's identifying, multiple people that would be a part of it. I just want to be careful of, it's the consistency that they're looking for, I feel like, in this policy to make sure that, we have that point of contact. But I do understand the concern that you have as well. I can think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't want to take yours off. Is it as simple as the superintendent or what's the right verb? Shall designate, yeah. For 3.1, that is.
Shall designate a point of contact for students.
Can I just make sure I understand, you're proposing that it read, the board designates the superintendent to designate a district point of contact?
No,
Is this about the board designating,
This is
or
delegate-
you wanted to say the superintendent designates?
Yes.
Well, the delegation responsibility is typically what will be in the AR, and so what the board is requiring to be in the AR. So what we could be requiring to be in the AR is someone needs to be designated as the district's point of contact for each student experiencing educational stability. And we don't need to be specific. We, the board, don't need to be specific about who it is. Trust the administration to name someone appropriate.
Yeah, so I think that's the change of language for point of contact for students versus point of contact for each student. I think that's where the difference is, right? So that provides the ability to have more than one person that could be a part of that. I mean, generally, it would be the same person unless we would have another disaster where we would have a lot more. But I do think that would satisfy the making sure we have someone, but it could open that up for more than one person.
So tell me what the suggested language is. I'm visual, I need to see it in writing.
So it would be the superintendent designates,
How about the superintendent shall designate a point of contact?
So what the code says is the school entity shall assign a point of contact to the student experiencing educational instability. So we could say to each student experiencing educational instability.
How about that? The superintendent shall designate a district point of contact for each student educational instability. Are you comfortable with that, Mrs. Summers?
Okay, and now words, okay.
Words. Okay, I'll start with the less substantive and then go to the more substantive. So 1.4,
I'm sorry, just back to that one real quick. The superintendent or designee, so that it's not necessarily incumbent on the superintendent to make that decision for everybody. I thought you might.
okay, so for 1.4, I would suggest striking the words, the board shall ensure that, and just have the sentence say, students experiencing educational instability shall have, equal access. Because again, this is our authority. So this is where we're kind of saying what we're sort of dictating at a high level. as opposed to it saying what we have to do. That's a little odd. So yeah, the point is we want students experiencing educational instability to have equal access. Yep, I think that works. And then more substantively, for 1.5, another policy that you may want to have, that we may want to give the authority to waive is actually 206, which is the one that talks about having to attend the school that's within the catchment that you live in, because that may not work for students with educational instability, depending on their circumstance. So I would just lump that one in as one that I would think we would be willing to waive under those circumstances.
Going back to the equal access on 1.4, could that be equitable access?
I don't think so, because I think the statute probably says the same educational, but we can verify that.
Okay.
I did read that, but I don't see. Well, it's first reading. We don't have to find it right now. That's a
Okay.
good question.
Okay. Jenna, did you have more comments on this? Okay. Jeff?
It's a real dumb thing. In 1.5.3, one of the things we're waiving is school-sponsored or extracurricular activities for which students meet placement and qualification requirements. What do we mean by meet placement and qualification requirements in that context?
If they're experiencing educational instability that causes them to fall afoul of some particular placement or qualification, maybe it's, completion of some assignment in time or something, that requirement can be waived, I think is what it says.
Yeah, I'm not saying we shouldn't waive it. That language just puzzled me.
I heard Stu say, and I think he's right, if we include the word must in between students and meet, does that help it make more sense?
Yeah, I like that.
Okay. Anything?
I had one more piece that I wanted to talk to the board about. So in the AR, towards the, let me find, towards the bottom, under students discharged from foster care. So that was one area because there's brackets there. So we have to identify what language we would like to use. So it says a student who has been discharged from foster care may be permitted to finish the either school year or semester in the district, if appropriate, and with payment of tuition or without payment of tuition. So, a student that has gone back to their family or has been adopted, depending on where they're at, where the family is at, we need to, we as a team have to decide what we want that to look like for that student. We can allow them to stay for the rest of the semester, the rest of the school year, and then with payment or without payment of tuition.
Typically, in a situation like this, we would first hear a recommendation from the administration on that. Do you have one yet?
I mean, for consistency for the child, depending on what they've been through, I would think that at least for the first part, to be able to have them stay for the remainder of the school year, to ensure the consistency for that student, I think would be, appropriate. As far as payment of tuition or without tuition, I don't know what the history has been here with that piece.
I don't know history either, but I would agree with the recommendation to allow them for the remainder of the school year. And, you know, maybe, and quite honestly, I also believe if a child is homeless and displaced for a particular reason, I'm not really inclined to say you need to pay tuition fees to continue here. You know, and the hope is that they secure, you know, residency, and we hope that that is still here at Upper Dublin. So I guess that would be my recommendation, is school year and without payment of tuition.
So this is for a student who has been discharged from foster care. Can you illuminate us on what typically happens when a student is discharged from foster care?
I think it depends on the situation. You know, an example would be discharged from foster care. Maybe they're going back to their family because the family member has gone through whatever they need to be fit to have that child back in their home. Or if a student is then adopted. So that would typically, those are the two areas that we typically will see when a student is discharged from foster care. It just, you know, depending on where that family is, that's why this piece is a part of the policy.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
we have a tuition policy for out of where we, and it's in school code too, where we can charge tuition for students who are not in our catchment area. So I think we're talking about the case where a student was in our school district for whatever reason during foster care, was discharged from foster care for either of those or presumably a bunch of other possible reasons, and wants to continue in Upper Dublin. So if they were adopted, the question is that, you know, is that a reason to waive? If tuition would apply in that case, which wouldn't necessarily apply, but if it does apply, would we waive it just because they just came out of foster care? That's sort of the question I think we're asking. And my inclination is I feel like it would depend on the circumstances, but I don't know how we could possibly codify that. And if codification is difficult, then you just default it without payment. But
I would without
yeah.
payment. I'm just
I mean, there's
gonna
some
say.
cases where I think it
it's-
would be appropriate to charge tuition, but I don't know
Imagine-
how we could possibly write the
But imagine
policy to
all
say
that.
If you look at 202, I pulled that up, that policy, it actually does have this table that says class 5. I mean, it calls it homeless students, so I guess that wouldn't really apply to a foster care child is not necessarily homeless, but in that case, we don't, it clearly says we would not charge tuition.
If they're adopted, then
Homeless
they're
anymore.
certainly not homeless. Actually, I don't know if that's true.
I mean, it could
That's
be a
probably true.
hardship on the, so if we're trying to remove barriers, help this child graduate. If they're adopted, it could be a hardship on the adoptive family to pay that tuition cost. And I think we could definitely find a space that wouldn't even cost us any money if they could be in classes that aren't full. Do you know what I mean? So it's not even, we're not talking about a lot of this happening very often. So it potentially wouldn't even cost us anything. Right.
Yeah, I say without tuition, because on top of what Jen just said, I think it could be a disincentive for the child to be able to be discharged from foster care, meaning like if there's adoptive parents that say, whoa, I've got to now pay X dollars to Upper Dublin for a year so that the child can finish the year. I don't want to create those kinds of disincentives for that child.
Additional consideration is just like what would the transportation parameters be? Like how far would we be I've been in scenarios where kids were wards of the state and they moved an hour and a half away, and it was a big burden.
I guess that is something to consider for this particular situation. I mean, homeless, we transport, I mean, that no questions. We usually will talk with other districts. They've been really helpful, and we sometimes will share those runs. But for something like this, that would be something we'd have to consider. You know, if the student is, similar to like an attendance exception, if the student is continuing to be here, but maybe the adoptive family lives out of the district, is that something where we would ask them to provide transportation, because they're not within the district, but we would let them, go to school here. So I don't know if that would just be a case-by-case kind of conversation, depending on, the needs of the family. But it is something that we would definitely need to consider and think about.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this policy? All right. So it is getting very late. And I'm wondering if how anyone feels about tabling the next, what do we have, 2 left? Yeah. So what?
I have a very small comment on 810 that maybe can be addressed before it gets brought back again. It's only first reading.
You promise it's small?
No, because I think it's small, but I could be
They
wrong.
always, okay,
I'm
so
not
hold
promising
up.
anything.
Mark is saying don't table it. Jenna, you're going to power through?
One more, I'm trying to.
Dr. Thomas? No?
Just a reminder, we have executive session yet as well.
I tried. It's not my fault.
I'm game.
Okay. We're going to power through. 810. Oh, jeez.
Okay, so 810, very repetitive, reviewed by our district solicitor. Administration is proposing a rewrite of this policy, which maintains district-specific language from the previous versions, but just more organized for the purpose of the policy. And then, again, the repeal. So any questions, thoughts as we move through these?
Okay.
Small or otherwise?
Start with the committee. Okay, I have a couple thoughts. I'll try and keep them. So several sections about safety were removed. One statement that said primary consideration being the safety of each student, like that was taken out. And also verbiage about annual presentation about school bus safety. So I'm just wanted to hear thoughts on this. I mean, I think having, the thing about school bus safety, especially, you know, at the elementary level, there's, who's in charge of that? So if it's not in policy, how do we know that's going to happen? Anyone? So there's one part.
Specifically, you're talking about what was struck in order to ensure the safety of students. A safety program will be for elementary and secondary students, that
Like
language.
that was taken out.
I know that Mr. Leckman and Mr. Robbins both reviewed the recommended changes from Mr. Diazio, and then there were further changes after that conversation. I can go back to them and say, you know, if the board would like some of that safety language back in there, we could absolutely do that.
Okay. I mean, I would be in favor of that, or just have somewhere in the AR or something without it, because it's the bus, there's no like teacher in charge of it. Do you know what I'm saying? So I want to make sure that we are explaining to students, you know, what the expectations are on the bus, and then.
And we do regularly have those. Our director of transportation, our transportation manager partner with our principals. They do those things inside buildings. They bring buses to schools. So like those things definitely are happening, but to your point of.
Yeah,
Just making
the question,
sure.
is the board stipulating that that must happen? That's
No, that's good.
what I think what Jen is asking.
Gotcha.
And then my other comment was in the AR, it said students must use their assigned bus stop. So I've seen this like over 10 or so years change from that to students, you know, like if they want to go to a friend's house after school and that friend's on the bus, you're allowed to do that. And then I've seen it change to you can ride any bus if you have a note to go to your friend's house. So I mean, as a parent, it's nice when the students can do that, but I want to hear, is that problematic at the school level? Or maybe there's an age where kids have that little bit of freedom there. Go ahead, Mark.
I don't think the policy has ever changed, the board policy has ever changed around those things. It's possible that practice has changed and maybe even documented practice has changed, but the board policy hasn't, and it is certainly problematic. There's oftentimes, exactly one seat per student. Like if a student wants to ride another bus just to go home with a friend, there might not be enough space on that bus for that to happen if all the routing happens perfectly and everyone is actually riding that day. Now, in practice, that almost never happens, but it could happen, and so I think it's problematic for us to say that a student can ride a different bus without permission. Now, the same bus getting off at a different stop or getting on at a different stop or whatever is another question. There's also some real problems with that from a security standpoint and the bus driver really knowing who's supposed to be getting on and getting off at this particular location.
But it also happens
But in
in the
practice, I mean, in
morning.
reality, we know it's going to happen.
It happens in the mornings too, because, you know, one same bus stops not too far from, and one's 10 minutes later. So sometimes kids will get on the other stop because they missed the first stop. So we're saying they
But I
can't
don't
do
think
that.
we can, I don't think we can authorize that. Even if in practice it works, I think we have to.
Agreed, and I think that's
Not allow
something
that.
Mr. Robbins maybe needs to reiterate with his staff. I have the same concerns Mr. Sirota mentioned about safety, and if the bus gets in an accident, knowing who's on that bus even. And the AR does have language about they're only permitted to ride the bus to which they are assigned and getting on and off at their assigned stop, but they can request to ride a different bus or vehicle, and it explains the process by which to do that, which there's a form they complete that goes to the transportation department, who then can consider, do we have enough seats? Do we have this or that? And they approve that then prior
Right.
to.
And would that be like a childcare situation? Like my child, it's not like this Friday, my kid wants to ride that bus. That's more, is that more like,
I
oh,
think
for the
this
next
is
2 months?
daily. I think this is daily. If it's like for the
Oh.
next 2 months, they're gonna contact transportation, we're gonna make an official change.
Okay.
This is like, hey, my daughter wants to go home and have a play date with
Oh,
so-and-so.
So there is, it is
Yeah.
in there.
Yes,
Okay.
it is in the AR,
Okay,
yeah.
all right. That's good. Good to know. Okay, so, go ahead.
So now that I'm looking at that language more carefully, so I agree, you know, they should only ride the bus vehicle to which they are assigned. This language that then says, and may only get on and off at their assigned stop. I mean, realistically, because this happens in my neighborhood all the time, kids miss their stop, so the parent drives them to my stop, which is one of the last stops. So we routinely have a couple stragglers who are on the bus, but they just, you know, they missed theirs, so they, you know, get driven to ours. I mean, I can't imagine, I don't think there's any way to stop that realistically, so I don't know how much we care about the particular stop. Again, I'll defer, this is in the AR, but I'm just throwing that out there that realistically it happens on the regular. But I totally agree, keeping them to the vehicle, because to your point, we need to know who's on that vehicle should something happen, but anyway.
I would like to talk to Mr. Robbins more, because in that exact same scenario, the stop is important depending on where the accident happened and who I expect to be on that bus or not. And if they're on the roster and I think they should be on and they're not, and where are they? Or they're on and I wasn't expecting them to. It could just be a block difference, but I mean, in those situations, it's pretty significant if they got on elsewhere. So I'd love to talk to him and get his input, and we can certainly do that.
I mean, in that particular scenario, this is for kids that miss their first stop. So that would just be like they never got on either way. I don't think in that particular scenario it would be an issue, but I'm sure it needs to be hashed out with Robbins. What?
You promised.
I explicitly did not promise. And it probably goes back to Jenna's point earlier and a point about, you know, Ed being new to this, and I think he probably wrote some of this language, but there's a bunch of places where it talks about the administrative regulation, at least in 22, 241, 271, where it says, as outlined in greater detail in the accompanying administrative regulation, or similar language in the other two. And it either we're saying that as a board that we want this to be in the administrative regulation, in which case it goes in the delegation of responsibility, or we're just putting it in policy. Like, it doesn't make, I don't like the way that that's structured in those, and it's at least those three places, but there might be others. So, you know, not a discussion, I don't think. I think it just can be revised when it gets brought back.
don't have to discuss it or answer it tonight, but I'm just curious, in 2.2, eligibility for transportation may be required to walk up to 1.5 miles to the bus stop. And I'm curious whether that is something that's new, or where's it come from? And I've been trying to play in my mind with the math in terms of the distances, the 1.5, and 2 for various schools. And does that number work with those? And I can't figure it out tonight. It's kind of late, but I just wanted to throw it out there if we could maybe get some information on that at some point.
I do have an email from Mr. Diazio regarding that. I don't recall exactly what it says right now, but I do believe the 1.5 comes maybe from statute or code somewhere. And then in 2.3.1, that is what our typical practice has been in the past. So, but I have that. I can find that and attach it.
Well, one thing I'd point out though is 2.2 talks about the distance to the bus stop. 2.3.1 talks about the distance to the school. So, right, for walkers, right? So I don't know if maybe that's why there's a difference, because if they're supposed to mean the same thing, then they're inconsistent, because 2.3.1 says 2 miles, 2.2 says 1.5. But I think that's why they're different, because, and again, I didn't check this statute, but you're probably right that it's statute lets you have the bus stop be 1.5 miles away. Realistically, I don't think we do that, but I guess we can, yeah.
Okay. I think that brings us to public participation. I see, right? Are we done?
Yeah, do we?
And we're going to repeal the other, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Hold on. Is the committee okay with repealing the, yes, yes. Okay, because it's included in the other. Okay, so with that, we are at public participation. Do I have to read this whole thing? I do not see anyone here. So I'm gonna close, can I do that, Jeff? All right, I'm just closing it. I'm closing public participation. Any extra comments? Okay, and with that, the meeting is adjourned. Oh, sorry, unadjourned. Next meeting is May 1, 2024, 7 p.m. It's late. We're doing re-adjourned. Now, re-adjourned.